last met as a church. Many of you have expressed an eagerness to get back together and worship together again. And so here we are. In reality, we've all been a little desperate for any sense of a return to normalcy in our lives, haven't we? Just how desperate we have been to get back to some sense of normalcy can be seen in the practice of the Julian Farrell Hair Salon in New York City. The owner, Julian Farrell, is now charging $1,000 for each styling as New York opens hair salons. $1,000 for a haircut. And he claims to have a waiting list of over 1,000 people who are willing to pay that much for one of his specialized cuts. Wow. But maybe we can understand that, for we've spent the last 3 months cutting our own hair, and in many cases the results have been disastrous, as these next couple of photos will demonstrate. This one was supposed to be a little off the back. This next one was supposed to be a little off the front. This one was supposed to be a little off the top. And this last one is just a little off. Maybe $1,000 for a haircut is not too much after all. There have been questions about reopening that many of us have been discussing. Conversations have been dominated by that subject, including the leadership here at the church. There was no clear answer as to when we should reopen or just how we should. Our leadership spent a few weeks researching and discussing and praying about that. Some churches, I've learned, stayed open throughout this entire pandemic. They cited the Bill of Rights. They claimed government interference. They insisted that they were essential businesses too, and acted in defiance of government mandates. But we decided to take the high road and follow the governor's guidelines, even though being a church has been difficult throughout this ordeal. Still, taking the high road was the right thing to do. Over the past month or so, we have explored the road that we as followers of Jesus are called to travel through life. We discussed, for instance, the narrow way, and we discussed the ancient path. This morning we're going to look at taking the high road. That message definitely is needed in our nation right now. Take the high road. For our nation is being ripped apart by low road behavior. We witness protests and riots that got out of control, arguments that have been spiteful, hate-filled speech, name-calling leveled at one another, about relationships with races, between races, and police arrests, and what is proper and what is not. And we are all, I think, in agreement that brutal treatment and the excessive use of force is wrong, but we're shouting at each other about it in public protests and on social media posts. The shouts get louder and the wounds get deeper, and not much positive is being accomplished in the process of all of that. We might vent our feelings on Facebook and feel better about it for a little while, but those who already agree with us will, of course, chime in with an amen, and while those who disagree get angrier and the division just grows. This is a time for all of us to take the high road. We can probably start by turning off the news. It's inflammatory. It seems to incite our passions. And then turn off your computer and keep your angry opinions about these subjects to yourself. Take the high road. You're likely aware that our actions will inspire responses from others, whether good or bad. Do you want someone to respond to you in anger, or do you want someone to respond to you in graciousness? However you answer that question tells us the tone that we should set with our words and our deeds. For we can either intensify a problem or de-escalate it, depending on whether we take the low road or the high road. Jesus taught taking the high road in his famous Sermon on the Mount, as it's recorded in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. On the high road, we acquire the right attitudes. Jesus taught us to rise above the moral law. He taught attitudes toward others should exceed human expectations and should exceed even Old Testament moral laws. We see examples of that, for instance, in Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus said, "You have been taught that it is wrong to commit murder, but don't even be angry or hateful toward others." He then said, "You've been taught eye for an eye justice, but it's best not to get even. Instead, turn your other cheek when someone does harm to you." And then he said, "You've been taught it's okay to hate your enemy, but it isn't. Love your enemy. Pray for that person. Do good for them." In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 15, we read that we should return good for evil. That's high road behavior. That's what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. To take the high road means to behave in a moral way, especially when others are not. It means to do the right thing, even though the right thing is not easy or immediately beneficial to us. It means to exhibit principled behavior instead of reactive responses. Often, taking the high road means making personal sacrifices for the best interest of others. It is to want what is noble, to want what is good. On the other hand, to take the low road is to react in an emotional response. It is the knee-jerk reaction that has not yet been subjected to careful and rational consideration. Taking the low road is often a response that is motivated by anger or vengeance or pride or hatred. It is always self-serving to take the low road. Jesus cares more about our attitudes than he does our actions. Does that statement surprise you? We might think the other. But the reason why is because it's possible for us to do the right thing for the wrong reason. It's possible for us to do the right thing with the wrong motives. And Jesus often criticized the religious leaders of his day for doing exactly that. That's why in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20, Jesus said, "I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." You see, the Pharisees were great at keeping exact details of the law, as we see an example in Matthew 23, verse 23, when Jesus said, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin." They were tithing to the extreme. They weren't required to tithe to that degree, but they were. Tithing to the extreme of even the herbs in their garden. They were great at keeping exact details of the law, but terrible at having the right attitude, as we see in the rest of this verse when Jesus continued. "But you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." Jesus pointed us to a higher road. He set a higher standard for us. Taking the high road and sacrificing for the good of another is typically not part of our culture, nor is it a quality that humans possess naturally. We tend to be fiercely independent. We tend to be self-focused. And therefore we too easily express our opinions in rude speech and crude gestures and in-your-face confrontations when we've been angered or hurt. The low road is much easier for us to walk. But for followers of Jesus, there really is no choice. We are called to take the high road. Colossians 4:6 instructs us, let your conversation be always full of grace, so that you may know how to answer everyone. We can rise above our culture. We can rise above our sinful nature by recognizing the sinful tendencies we are inclined to, and by feeding our souls on what helps us rise above those sinful ways, and by allowing God to transform us so that we are more than our sinful human selves would be left to ourselves. You choose to walk the high road. When an acquaintance says something tacky to you, take the high road. When a coworker makes himself look good by making you look bad in comparison, take the high road. When someone says something malicious about you with the intention to hurt you, take the high road. Don't settle for small attitudes or behaviors. Rise to greater ones. Jesus himself walked the high road, and he calls us to walk it with him. On the high road, we acquire the right attitudes. And on the high road, we develop the right ethics. Jesus taught virtue over morality. Do you know the difference between those two, virtue and morality? Morality is restraining ourselves from doing the wrong. Virtue exceeds that. Virtue is aspiring to do the right. A Dr. Bruce Bailey wrote, the virtuous person moves beyond moral behavior to a higher stage of achievement. Virtue, in other words, is a higher standard of behavior than morality is. We see the difference between those two in the most popular statement Jesus ever made. In Matthew 7:12, we know it as the golden rule. You're familiar with what it says. Do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Did you know that Jesus was not the first person to teach that principle? In fact, some variation of it has existed in many ancient cultures, including some which preceded the time of Jesus on this earth. Here are a couple of examples. About 600 or 700 years before the time of Christ, the Chinese philosopher Confucius taught, what you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. About 300 years later, the Greek philosopher Socrates wrote, what stirs your anger when done by others, do not do to others. And then about a century before Jesus was born, the Jewish rabbi Hillel taught, do not do to thy neighbor what is hateful to thyself. Now, if you look at these carefully, you'll notice that all of them are very close to one another, but they all differ from what Jesus taught in the Golden Rule slightly. These are moral laws designed to teach us what not to do, designed to teach us to restrain from doing the wrong, from doing harm to another. Jesus took those moral laws and he made them into a virtue. He made it about doing good for others. It had been a passive law. Don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. If you leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. But Jesus made it an active law of love and compassion. Do the good for another that you would prefer that they would have done to you. The difference between morality and virtue can also be seen in the story that Jesus told of the Good Samaritan. Do you remember that story? A man was walking from one city to another, somewhere out in the countryside, alone on the road. He was attacked by a band of robbers. They beat him severely, stole everything that he had, and left him laying alongside the road, badly injured. A priest passed by that man, saw him on the road and kept walking. A little later, a Levite, someone of the priestly tribe, also saw that man laying on the road, walked right on past him. They each did no harm to the man. They were not the ones who had beaten and robbed him. Their consciences were cleared because they did not break a moral law by hurting him, but neither did they do good for him. You see, they were moral, but not virtuous. And then in Jesus' story, a Samaritan man happened down that road. He too saw the injured man laying alongside the road, but he stopped to help. And at his own expense, he provided lodging and food and medical care for this injured man. He exemplified the golden rule. He did the compassionate, virtuous thing. He took the high road. Jesus taught more than morality. He taught grace. Grace means giving someone what they need rather than what they might have earned. Grace means treating another person better than they deserve. Grace means treating another person better than they have treated you. It's the high road. It's what Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 5, verses 23 and 24, when he said, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift. You see what Jesus is saying? If somebody has a problem with you, you may not have a problem with them. But if somebody has a problem with you, first go and rectify that situation. You take the initiative. Bring healing into that relationship. That, Jesus said, is more important than worship. Graciousness. He taught the same thing in verse 40 of that same chapter. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Give them more than you're asking for, more than they deserve. That's a tough teaching, isn't it? And then in chapter 6, verse 14, Jesus said, if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. We are to forgive those who hurt us. We've all been wounded, hurt by someone. We've all been mistreated. The worst thing that we could do is to pick at that scab and reopen that wound. Remember when you were young and your mother taught you, stop picking your scab. She was right. Let that wound heal. Leave past pains in the past and move on toward a healthy future. Take the high road. It was October 2nd, 2006, that Carl Roberts entered an Amish schoolhouse in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, with malicious intent. He shot 8 little girls aged 6 to 13, killing 5 of them, and then he ended his own life. The Amish community was rocked by this tragedy, but their first act was to forgive the family of Carl Roberts. A grandfather of one of those murdered Amish girls told his relatives not to hate the killer. He said, we must not think evil of this man. An Amish neighbor comforted the Roberts family hours after the shooting and extended forgiveness to them. Other Amish community members visited and comforted the shooter's widow and his parents. Amish people set up a charitable fund for the family to help with their funeral expenses. 30 members of the Amish community attended his funeral, offering condolences to the Roberts family for their loss. Roberts' wife wrote an open letter to her Amish neighbors, thanking them for their forgiveness, grace, and mercy. She wrote, your love for our family has helped to provide the healing we so desperately need. Gifts you've given have touched our hearts in a way no words can describe. Your compassion has reached beyond our family, beyond our community, and is changing our world. And for this, we sincerely thank you. That schoolhouse was demolished a week later, and a new school was built near that site. It is called New Hope School. That is how we change the world. Not by violent protests, not by angry criticism, not by seeking vengeance, but by taking the high road. Racism, hatred, retaliation, those are sin problems that only Christ can resolve. A preacher friend of mine observed that we cannot solve those problems by kneeling for the national anthem. We can only resolve them by kneeling before God. And we are called to do that, to kneel at the foot of the cross, and then to walk beyond it on the high road. Perhaps God is calling you today to the foot of the cross to make some commitment of your life to him or to his church. God is certainly calling all of us to walk the high road. And he will use us to bring blessing into this world as we do. Let's stand and sing together our invitation hymn.